Ready? We're rolling. Okay, good. Okay, everybody. Hope everybody's doing good out there. Hello again, and thank you for joining me today to talk about our Cuvee le Bec wine, specifically the 2018 vintage of Cuvee le Bec. Le Bec is really become, one of the things that I look, probably most forward to every vintage to put together. It's definitely our, let's say, broadest, most diverse blend that we put together. We're working with a lot of different lots and making this wine. But before we get into the wine, I want to just quickly talk about how we came to make a Cuvee le Bec in the first place, and some of that history and that stuff that's involved. So all the way back in 1995, we started an experimental program, which actually has turned into the theme of the winery, with some Rhone varieties, specifically with Syrah and Grenache and some Mourvedre. And in those first couple of vintages, we were purchasing the fruit back then. We were just really focused on making varietal wines. So we were making a Syrah, we were making a Grenache, and we were making a Mourvedre. And during that same time in the 90s, I got pretty excited about these GSM wines, these Australian Grenache, Shiraz, Mourvedre, Mataro, that they call it down there, wines, these blended wines, and thought like, hey, maybe we should be looking at doing some sort of blend with Grenache and Syrah and Mourvedre. And so in 1997, we assembled our first vintage of a Cuvee le Bec. And it was more of a Grenache-based wine back then, with a healthy amount of Syrah and just a touch of Mourvedre. But really wound up making something that was pretty exciting. At that point, it was the GSM, the Aussie model was really kind of in my head. And so we were looking for these pretty fruit-driven, ripe, kind of lush style of wine that really, is where the Cuvee le Bec kind of got started. And so during that same time in 97, 98, 99, those were also the years that we were doing the initial developments of our Purísima mountain vineyard. And so, I knew for sure that we had to definitely include a healthy amount of Syrah and Grenache and Mourvedre into our plantings, into our initial plantings of Purísima mountain. And then that also kind of carried over to the Tom and Judy Beckmen, the estate vineyard here, where we have some Mourvedre and some Grenache and just a touch of Syrah planted here as well, which came a little bit later when we did the redevelopment of this property in the early 2000s. So the other kind of really famous area for this style of wine, this Rhone blend wine, is the Rhone Valley. It is the southern Rhone Valley. It is Côte du Rhône. It is Châteauneuf-du-Pape. It is Gigondas. All those areas, those appellations, are what was really at the heart of even the GSM wines, the Aussie wines that I was kind of turned on to at the time, and really was kind of the impetus that got me started on making a Cuvée le Bec wine. The le Bec wine has really grown a lot, obviously, since then, and something that is a really vital piece of the Cuvée le Bec every vintage was the addition of the fourth varietal into the blend, the Counoise grape, and that came along with the 2000 vintage. Really, it came along with Purísima mountain and production and the vineyards starting to yield grapes. And that was the first year that we had any crop. And so thus the introduction of the Counoise grape into the blend, a grape that is definitely the most obscure of the four that we use in the wine. I got turned onto it personally through our friends up at Tablas Creek, who I know I've mentioned before. They are one of the few people in their Châteauneuf property that actually use a substantial mentionable, let's say, percentage of the Counoise grape into their Chateauneuf wine. And they had brought over some Counoise cuttings into California, and these are some of the cuttings that we were able to get a hold of in the late 90s and plant out on the vineyards. I personally did a tasting up there 20 plus years ago, where we actually went through some of the individual varieties that make up their blends. And I was just really blown away by the Counoise. It was just, as varietal wines, to me, it was almost the most standout wine of any of the varieties that I had. I mean, I think that I took it like, we at that time were really striving to make the best varietal wines that we possibly could. So we wanted to make the best varietal Syrah or Grenache or Mourvedre or whatever we were doing. And their take on it was a little bit different. They were necessarily trying to make the greatest individual varietal, but they were looking at a blend. They were looking at components. They were looking at what these pieces, what Syrah or Grenache or Mourvedre would bring into their wine. And so it was a real eye-opening experience for me to taste through them individually and then to learn how these people with centuries, decades for sure, of experience blending these varietals went about, going and creating their blend. And it really opened up my eyes to the fact that not everything that we made for our blended wine needed to be the greatest individual varietal wine that we made. Like, we could find a place for that component, whether that component had more texture or more spice flavor or floral quality or whatever it could be, and didn't necessarily stand alone as a great wine. We could bring it together with other components and create the Cuvee le Bec. And so the Counoise grape was really vital. I mean, I think that now our Cuvee le Bec, after making 18, 19 vintages with Counoise blended into it, it has become a real integral part of the wine, from a structure, texture, and slightly flavor component. And I like to say that the Cuvee le Bec, when we're blending it here in the lab, really isn't Cuvee le Bec until we've added that 5, 6, 7, 8% of Counoise into it. Just to mention real quickly how I got the name, how we created the name of Cuvee le Bec. It's kind of a fun story. So as many of you guys probably know, my family, my father and mother, they came out of the musical instruments business, the synthesizer, electronic musical instruments business. And so, I was thinking of synthesis and all these cool musical names. But a funny story, my parents had recently, well, not recently, but back then had recently come back from a trip to France, and my mom she was just fascinated by this place that was called Chateau le Bec. Chateau le Bec. She wanted so badly for us to name the winery Chateau le Bec. And, I just kind of looked at Mom, and I just didn't see the chateau here, right? I mean, now their house, I guess you could say, is a chateau. But back then, 25 years ago, this was dirt and gravel and barns, and had a real farmy kind of quality to it. It wasn't really striking me as a chateau. So I thought that was a little bit of a stretch for, the winery name. But that name Le Bec always stuck in my head. And so when I would make lists of names, and that's how I go about doing it. If I'm trying to come up with a name, I'll just start making lists and have different ideas. And it's something that I do over, a long months of time. I would just write down Cuvee le Bec or Le Bec, and it was on every list. And it was just, the one that I just went back to and back to and back to. It was the one that stuck with me. It is a nice play on our name. The Le Bec is the beak or the nose in France, so it does have this kind of, wine, connection to it, obviously. And so back at that time, we were actually working with a marketing company. They were marketing and selling our brand Beckmen nationally. And they thought I was crazy. Like, Cuvee le Bec, like, what kind of a bad and lame name is that? And but you know what? I just obviously it's our vineyard and our winery, and that's what we wanted the name to be. And so now, after 20-something vintages of Cuvee le Bec, 21 vintages released to be specific, I think the name has found a home, it's found a place, and it's found an identity, and it's really almost become like its own brand to me, the Cuvee le Bec. So just wanted to share that funny little story with you about the origin of the name Cuvee le Bec. And cuvee, for those of you who don't know what cuvee is, it's just a general term for any sort of blend. It could be a Chardonnay cuvee, or it could be a multi-grape blend like our Cuvee le Bec, just so that you guys know what the word cuvee means. So the wine, like I said, has really developed over the 20-something years that we've made it. And I think it's developed in a really good way. And I think that what we were initially looking for in some of the first vintages of the Le Bec, you know, that kind of in-your-face, super ripe, you know, lush style of wine, it still has a play in the Cuvee le Bec, but I think the wine has evolved, and we've wanted it to evolve into being something more than that. And then, you know, what I feel like, you know, there are a couple of things that we look to in Cuvee le Bec, and the one main thing that we want Cuvee le Bec to be every vintage is balanced, right? We want to create this balanced blend, but it's balanced in all its components and all its parts and its mouthfeel and its structure. And so that's really the hallmark for me of Cuvee le Bec, is creating this balanced wine. And it's really so fun to be able to take all these different, you know, varieties that we use, the 4 in this wine, and then all of the different blocks and all of the different, you know, picks and the different clones and stuff. This wine is a really diverse wine. It really reflects the diversity of our site and our property. And just to give you guys an idea, I do have my maps, and I don't know, you guys probably noticed who have been with us before, that we're no longer in the tasting room location, but we are now in the winery location. So I don't know if everybody can see this, or she's going to move the cameras around, but this is a map of Purisima Mountain, and all of these little areas here, if you can see them, are all individual blocks of wine, grapes that grow out there. And so the Cuvee le Bec now, I would say, this 2018 is a blend of roughly 18 different lots of Syrah. So these are Syrahs that are coming out of all these different blocks on the vineyard here. It's about 7 different blocks or lots of Grenache that come out of here. So the Grenache is like this color down here. This is a Syrah color here. And then it's got a couple of different lots of Mourvedre. The Mourvedre is over here, and it's got a single lot of Counoise. And I believe one of the lots in the 2018 was a co-fermented lot. So oftentimes we'll, you know, co-ferment some of these lots together, and it was a co-fermented lot of Mourvedre and Counoise. They're both roughly picked, you know, within days of each other, usually every year. And so sometimes we'll go about, you know, kind of making the blend as early as possible. So the wine really captures the diversity of our site, for sure, the diversity of all the different blocks and all the different hillsides and aspects and elevations. And then you throw on top of that the clonal diversity to it as well, with 7 different clones of Syrah being involved in the Cuvee le Bec, 3 different clones or selections of Grenache, and a couple of different Mourvedre selections in there usually as well. So the wine is just, we have so much to work with and so much to play with when we're going about and creating Cuvee le Bec every year. And that's just on Purisima. We also have a little bit of, you know, fruit that we use from the estate property here too. This is the Tom and Judy Estate Vineyard, where we have the Grenache block, the younger head train block that you look at from the decks of the tasting room, little bit of the older Grenache block, and a little bit of the Mourvedre that's by the road than when you drive in. So this wine, you know, not only covers both of our vineyards, but it really covers, you know, the breadth of both of our vineyards, the diversity that we have, both in the site and the varieties and the clones. And then something that I think that we've learned over the years, is to really embrace that diversity, embrace it not only in the in the vineyard, excuse me, but also in the winery. And so, we'd like to incorporate a lot of different techniques in the winery. Picking decisions are made at, different sugar levels, different potential alcohol levels. All of those things are giving us, this palette, these layers, these components that when we go to blend this wine, we have, just so much to work with and so much to play with, where, we're embracing, wines basically that range in alcohol from roughly like 13% to a little over 15%. And with that, you're getting, different expressions of fruit, you're getting textural expressions, you're getting structured expressions as well. And then, the techniques like, including some whole cluster fermentation, letting some wines or lots, be pressed with a little bit more skin contact and a little less skin contact, a little time in the fermenters. All of these things on top of, a great number of the barrel, diversity that we use and the barrel size diversity that we use, again, which we've touched on a little bit in Grenache in these segments, but where we're making this wine with standard 60-gallon barrels all the way up to our 500-liter punch-in barrels that we use. So this wine just, really allows us in the winery to really, play around and express ourselves with the idea that all these parts and all these components have a final place. They have a place in the blend when we go ahead and try to put together our 2000 or whatever vintage of Cuvee le Bec. So just quickly again, before I get into tasting the wine, and don't wait for me to taste the wine because I usually have a lot to say before I get into that, is I just wanted to touch again on 2018 and the vintage. We're really now just starting to release more of these 2018 vintage wines. We've released a few of them. We'll have more obviously coming up in the next few months and into 2021. The vintage, kind of started off, I'll be honest with you, I didn't know going into it that it was going to be as good of a vintage that it turned out to be. Spring was a little rough. The early part of the summer was a little rough, and that the weather, was a bit unpredictable, and I guess it's always a little unpredictable, but maybe a little bit more unpredictable than normal. It didn't really maybe set up in the spring to be a great vintage. There was, a fair amount of unevenness in some of the vines and some of the blocks, and, that came all out of that kind of, tough spring that we had that year. But things really came together in the vintage kind of after July. July was an incredibly hot month. I think it's one of the hottest months that I've ever, lived here in the San Ynez Valley, where we had just like almost 90, plus degrees just about every day. And that helped to catch some things up and to move some things along and to push them along. But then August and September and October came along, and the weather, I mentioned this before, just turned unreal. I mean, it was beautiful. It was just, just picture perfect, and really was the main reason I think that the 2018 wines have turned out as well as they have across the board, including this Cuvee le Bec. So with that said, I'm going to jump in and I guess taste the wine. I've tasted it a few times before, but something to me that really, jumps out on this wine, which maybe we don't get too much of every year, are some real floral components. The wine has, there's just this nice kind of violety, lavender, it just has these nice floral components. The wine is typically, very fruit driven, and this one certainly is. And then it has a certain spice component to it. So it's nice to get this other layer of flavor in there, and that's bringing this, like, again, this floral component to it. You know, the Le Bec is always, you know, very diverse in its, you know, fruit profile, because it has darker flavored grapes like Syrah and Mourvedre, and then brighter flavored grapes like Grenache and Counoise. So you always get that kind of nice mix of dark fruits and brighter red fruits in the wine. And again, that little bit of spicy, kind of peppery quality that just is a little bit of a part of all these Rhone varieties. But I don't know that we've had a vintage with Cuvée le Bec where we've had as much of that, you know, floral component. And I think it might be something that's really maybe, you know, setting this wine apart from some of the previous wines that we did, at least to me, aromatically. Now, the other thing that this wine has a ton going on in is the mouthfeel and texture. And I'm going to jump right into that. You know, it just has this really beautiful mouthfeel to it. It's just, I really don't even know how to describe it. I mean, I can use the, you know, rounded, that kind of language, but it has, to me, something more than that. It has this, I don't know, like caressing quality, this just, I don't know, this I guess I just don't know how to describe it. I mean, I guess I'm gonna have to fall back on my words like round and soft and stuff like that, but to me it's something more than that. It has, you know, this textural component that just grabs at me and makes me want to, you know, keep going back and back to it. And, you know, I'd like to think that I've tasted, you know, a lot of great wines in my life. And there's just something about the mouth feel and texture of great wine. And I think that the 18 Cuvée le Bec, you know, just hits that, you know, quality to me. And I know it's hard to describe that because it's what I'm tasting and not necessarily what you're tasting. But it does have that hallmark quality. Yes, we do have a question.
At what temperature would you serve this wine at, and do you need to let it breathe?
Yeah, really good question. I tend, you know, here at the winery to be pretty spoiled on temperature. So just about everything that we're tasting here, when we're making the wines and blending the wines, is all coming out at a cellar temperature. So for us, that's, you know, probably about 58 degrees. Now, granted, you know, not everybody and not all glasses, not everything's going to be picture perfect, and you're not going to be able to keep it at 58 degrees. So I do think that there is a range of temperature. I think for me, you know, that range is probably in that, you know, 56 to maybe 64 or 5 range. Definitely don't want to let the wine get too warm. And I would maybe even, you know, keep it on the little bit of the cooler side, the chilled side. As far as aging, I mean, I think the Cuvée le Bec isn't necessarily a wine that you need to wait for. You know, it's really crafted to be ready to go, usually when it's released. But it is a wine that has the potential to age for a really long time. And some of you guys may have had some older Cuvée le Becs in your library, or maybe you've purchased some older Cuvée le Becs that we've offered over the last many years. But we have Cuvée le Becs going all the way back to the 97 vintage. And I'll be honest with you, they are all good. Now, maybe some of the really old ones, you need a little bit of an appreciation for really older wine and some of the oxidative qualities that come with it. But the wine has the potential to age for a really long time. And this 2018, for as good as it is now, I mean, in its closure and capsule, I mean, I would think at least 25 years on this one.
We have someone drinking the 2013. John says it's fantastic. Rich, full, smooth, fruity, spicy.
Yes.
Remember anything about the 13 vintage?
I mean, I know that 13, and thank you, John, for sharing that with us. The 13 vintage was another really outstanding year, for sure. I do remember that. It was, you know, at the beginning of our drought. It was a warmer vintage, for sure. And I do remember having a lot of quality wines from the 2013 vintage, for sure. I remember Syrah being particularly a hallmark kind of a benchmark variety from 2013, but I also remember some really outstanding Grenache. So not surprising to me that that 2013 wine is showing as well as it is today. I thank you for that. I actually haven't tried the 13 wine, and I have so many of these under my belt that I don't necessarily remember the blend of that wine, but I think that was a similar blend to the 18 in that it was a little bit more on the Syrah side than the Grenache side. And I guess I could mention that because I didn't really mention the blend, but most of you guys probably have a bottle in front of you. But this wine is 45% Syrah, 39% Grenache with 9% Mourvèdre and 7% Counoise. And so if you look back historically on Cuvee le Bec, Grenache and Syrah are going to be the two leading varietals every year, with the Mourvèdre and the Counoise coming in at lower percentages. Now, over the last many years, they seem to be, the Mourvèdre in particular on some of the early vintages was in the mid-teens in percentage, but it's been hovering in that, maybe 9 to 12% range for a lot of vintages now, and as it is in the 2018 wine. So the wine is typically always a little bit of more Syrah and Grenache than it is Mourvèdre and Counoise. And then some vintages are a little bit more Grenache heavy and other vintages are a little bit more Syrah heavy. I want to say that over the past 5 to 7 years, the Syrah heavy side has been the way that we've been leaning. It's been the way that the wines have been coming together in the winery. And I want to say maybe just 2 out of the last 5 or 6 vintages have been more Grenache based than Syrah based. But we seem to have really found something now with this Syrah portion being the highest percentage. It still carries a lot of Grenache flavor and a lot of Grenache impact. It still carries the brightness and the structure, the acidity and the freshness. But the Syrah component just really adds this nice depth to it, this, kind of, let's say, deeper, darker, more mouth-filling, more round quality to it, interestingly enough. And I think a lot of maybe the complexity of spice and pepper and certainly the floral components that come, to play in this 18 wine are coming out of that Counoise or coming out of that Mourvèdre. Our Mourvèdre on Purisima Mountain is not what I would think of, as being typical Mourvèdre. When I would think of Mourvèdre, I think of a lot of meaty, gamey, dark, animal, kind of qualities, to the wine, where ours on Purisima is brighter. It's got a more red spectrum. It's got a floral component. It has a peppery quality to it, and a little bit higher acid quality to it than normal. And I think that runs, true with the Counoise as well, where it definitely leans on that brighter, spicier side. And I think in 2018, that's where a lot of that florally component is coming from. But I also think it comes from the Syrah as well, as we kind of mix up our, picking decisions and are getting Syrah at maybe different ripeness levels. We'll see more of those violet qualities come out of the wine. Yeah, we have another question.
Do you blind blend like Tablas does?
We blend really different than Tablas. Tablas blends with a lot of people. They have a pretty large group and do it blind. And I'm kind of the sole blender here, although I do bounce a lot of things off of the winemaking crew as they get closer to making a decision. So just that in itself is really different, but I don't necessarily blind blend. I think that for me, this wine is really coming out of the vineyard. And I'm sure Tablas is as well, but ours are like, we have a really good idea going into each vintage where each particular grape is going to wind up, whether it's going to be a Purisima Syrah or a Clone 1 or a Block 6 or a Purisima Grenache or a Cuvee le Bec. And a lot of those decisions that we go into picking and crafting and making the wine are all based on where it's going to wind up. So we basically have like a bunch of blocks and lots that are designated ideally first and foremost for Cuvee le Bec. And so with that in mind, I don't necessarily need to blind look at them because they are what they are coming out of the vineyard. And that's just my take, and that's where they have historically been placed, or that's where, I just find that their best fit is. So we'll take these, 18 lots of Syrah, let's say, for the 2018 wine, and we'll taste, obviously, all the individual lots and make sure that everything is cool with them, make sure that they're good, make sure that there's nothing wrong with them. And then we'll actually assemble all of those Syrah lots together and make a Cuvee le Bec Syrah portion of the wine. And then we'll do the same thing with the Grenache, and we'll do the same thing with the Mourvèdre, and then we'll do the same thing with the Counoise. So if at that time we find something that is wrong, or something that is like so good that it needs to be moved into another wine, that then we'll move it into that other wine. But other than that, we'll get these larger components of Syrah and Grenache and Mourvèdre and Counoise together, and then I can fine-tune the blend. I can fine-tune what percentages of each, where we're going to find the Cuvée le Bec every year. And I think now, after making a lot of years of it, I have a really good idea of what the blend is going to be almost before I even put the blend together. And that's just, the experience, I guess, that I have in making this wine over so long, and always using the same grapes and the same vineyards pretty much, unless there's something new that comes up, that allows us to make that wine that way. I think initially we blended the wine more like a blind type of thing, where we would, put these wines out, just taste through them, start assembling blends. Because at that time we didn't have the experience, and we didn't have maybe the knowledge about the vineyard blocks, because they were all relatively new and young, and didn't know really the direction of the wine. So interestingly enough, it's 2018 when we put this blend together after the component parts were blended. We had some subtle tweaking. We did not use all of the Grenache that we had set aside for the Cuvée le Bec, because it was just too much. There wasn't balance in that wine. And so we pared back, the Grenache portion a little bit, which brought the Syrah portion to be a little bit higher percentage, and also brought up the Counoise and Mourvèdre, because it's very important for us to keep those Counoise and Mourvèdre numbers and levels of percentages at a certain point, because of their impact on the overall Cuvée le Bec. So hopefully that explains how we go about making the wine now, but maybe it doesn't.
Can you explain the different outcomes between co-ferment versus blending after it's fermented?
Yeah, that's a really great question. We've always been really big believers in trying to blend as early as possible, right? We want to compose these blends so they can have time to age together, to marry, to become one wine, and I think that still holds true. So if we can do some co-fermenting, because we know this lot is going to be Le Bec, we know all the Counoise we grow basically is going to be Le Bec. So, we can take some of that Counoise and we can blend it with some of the Mourvèdre component. We can blend it with some of the Grenache component. And then those, actually are easier to blend together because they're picked all around the same time. It's really hard for us to do a co-ferment of Syrah and Counoise because they're kind of coming at different ends of the vintage. We start with the Syrah and we end with the Counoise and Mourvèdre. So it makes it a little challenging. The Syrah would be pretty pruny and raisiny if we left it out there and waited for it, the Counoise to get ripe. But as much of that, early blending that we can do is great. And so to be able to blend it on the crush pad is fantastic. Now, when you blend a Mourvèdre Counoise or something together and you co-ferment it, you're not getting Mourvèdre or Counoise, you're getting a Mourvèdre Counoise blend. And so you're getting components of both of the grapes and both of the wines in one component of the Le Bec. So, and then beyond that, basically after our malolactic fermentations are done, which is, anywhere from maybe starting in March, April, May in a year, depending on the year, that's when we'll really start to put blends together and really put those components and make our larger blends. So typically I'd say by June every year the Le Bec is blended. And then it's put back and aged for additional time in barrel, so it again has that chance to marry and to come together and to create, that seamless. I think that if you blended later, which we might do with very small percentages if something isn't like exactly the way that we want it prior to going into the bottle, that the wine hasn't had a chance to grow and be one wine together, and you might run into something where 3 months down the line or 6 months down the line or a year or 2 years down the line that maybe it's not what you really intended it to be. And so that's why I think it's so critical for us to do the blending as early as possible. Yeah.
How does the Cuvee le Bec compare to a typical Chateauneuf du Pape?
Well, that's a really good question too. I mean, the blend is different. Chateauneuf du Pape, first of all, does not really use this much Syrah in their wine, typically. So their wine is going to be more Grenache based. It's going to be, some like Tablas Creek, more Vedra based. And the Syrah is going to be a smaller component. So whereas we have similar varieties, obviously the same varieties that we're using, one of the big differences between this wine and a Chateauneuf is that Syrah is such a heavy player in our particular wine in the Cuvee le Bec, and it's maybe not as big of a player in Chateauneuf du Pape. To me, actually, the 18, even with 49% Syrah, does have like a bit of Chateauneuf going on. I mean, I think some of the floral, qualities are certainly things that I, recognize as Chateauneuf du Pape. Some of the peppery qualities, certainly, things like lavender are, qualities of Chateauneuf, and some of the bright fruit that you get with Grenache. But the wine, certainly has similarities to Chateauneuf, but I mean, it's from Santa Barbara, it's from San Ynez, it's from California. It's not a French wine. And it's not intended to be a French wine or to mimic a French wine. It's basically these grapes, these Rhone grapes, these same grapes that they'll use in Chateauneuf du Pape, grown on our vineyards in Ballard Canyon and San Ynez and Los Olivos, and grown to express what those grapes are, from our area. And with that, the wine is probably a little bit fruitier in a lot of ways due to our, maybe just touch more sunshine, longer season. I think that's a big thing compared to Chateauneuf. We probably have a good, 4 to 6 weeks more of length in our season versus they do, which can, definitely, change some wines. But a really, really good question. Honestly, the blend is a little bit more Côte du Rhône-esque than it is Chateauneuf if you just looked at the straight varieties. Côte du Rhône wines typically have a higher percentage of Syrah in them, typically. It's hard to generalize because every estate and every chateau over there is different, just like it is here. But that is an excellent question. Yes?
Why do you use a screw cap, and how many cases are you making of this wine?
Yeah, so we made a switch with this wine it's been a lot of years. I mean, Neil, do you remember? 7? 9? Okay, yeah. That's right, 9. So we started the screw cap adventure around 2007, 8. We'd been coming off some kind of sketchy cork years, Now the cork industry has, I know that might sound weird, some sketchy cork years, but, the cork industry had some issues, in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And there was a lot of variability and a lot of cork taint and a lot of problems. And so, we started experimenting with screw caps in our whites and rosé. And then Cuvee le Bec actually was the first red wine that we did under a screw cap in 2009. And that vintage, we actually did half of it in screw cap and half of it in cork. We were a little worried about the screw cap. We were a little worried about how people might perceive it. But the market showed really great acceptance to it, especially our restaurant friends who just loved the screw cap versus the cork. They knew the bottle was going to be, sound. And it's just so much easier for them to do that than it is to do a corkscrew. That I think that they found a lot of appreciation from that. Now, I think the screw cap closure is a really great closure, and it's a really great closure for this wine. It's also a great closure for our whites and rosés. It's a, I find it to be a great closure for the Saint Ynez Grenache that we use it on. They really are a tighter seal than cork, and they're a more consistent seal than cork. Cork obviously is a natural product, so there's a little bit of inconsistencies that you get out of, the different porosities, the different densities and hardness of corks and how they vary. And so the screw cap really allows just amazing consistency. And then what's been our biggest surprise is how well the wines have aged under screw cap. I mean, I know that we recently sold some 09 Le Bec under cork and under screw cap, and I was just blown away by the quality of the screw cap. It really kept the wine a bit fresher for longer, and I think that's really important for this wine as well as our whites and the Grenache that we bottle it. So again, really, really great question. So anyway, I just really am thrilled with the 2018 Le Bec. Obviously, Matt Kettman from the Wine Enthusiast was, obviously liked the wine, was kind enough to give it a, nice high score, like 95 points. It's, kudos really to, everything that we do here, our vineyard crew, the guys that work, every day out there, managing and taking care of and farming our vineyard blocks and doing the biodynamic sprays and preparations, and then to our crew in the winery. I mean, I couldn't be happier with the crew that we have in production right now. Abel Herrera, the cellar master, he's been basically at my side for the last 6 years. So he's developed a great palate. He's developed a great sense of the winery and how we make the wine, and really kind of has, learned together with me. Not only that, he can, knows all the equipment back and forth way better even than I do. And so he's just such a, wonderful, person to have on staff here. And then our enologist, Rory Baldwin, who's been with us for a couple of years, has just been a great add to the team. He just brings a lot to the table as far as his knowledge and experience. And he's been, incredibly helpful for me, for sure, in the winery portion of it. So, really, it's a team effort, and I have a tendency to overstate I when I do these things or when I talk about the winery, because I have a certain, I think, sense of ownership to it. But I never want to neglect or forget about, the incredible help that we get from, our vineyard crews. And our vineyard crews are very consistent too, up until, a few years ago, as some of them have gotten older and have moved on. We do have an influx of, about half of it is newer blood over the last couple of years, but we still have, several individuals who planted the first grapes on Purissima that still work with us. And I think that, consistency is really, what allows us to bring consistency in our wine year in and year out. And so, the score like that is wonderful. It makes me feel good. It can pump up my ego and whatnot. But, I don't do it by myself. And so I just want everybody to know, how important those guys are to what we do here. And the big part of, the quality that we were able to achieve in this particular wine. And then I think for me, obviously I'm a bit biased, but all the wines that we make here, have a certain level of quality that we try to, achieve and hit. And I think successfully, more successfully now than ever. And again, that has a lot to do with the people that are behind the making of it. So I really hope that you've enjoyed this, talk. I want to thank the few people. Is there another question before we sign off?
I was wondering what your favorite food pairing for Cuvee le Bec is.
Oh, that's a really good question too. What I love about Le Bec is its, diversity. It is, a wine that can be had with all sorts of different foods. But I'm going to always be heading back to the grill, honestly, with Cuvee le Bec. So, grill me up some, pork loin with a nice, spicy rub on it. maybe with a little, I had one with a little mango salsa the other night with a little Cuvee le Bec. I thought that was really outstanding. So really anything that you want to throw on the grill would be fantastic. I've also had it with some seafood, some heartier seafood dishes where it does, stand up well. But I would, probably stick to the grill personally with the Le Bec. So anyway, thank you guys so much for joining me today. It's been really awesome, and we're going to have to probably set up something for next month. Hopefully we'll squeeze another one in before harvest, because we'll probably have to shut down the live programs during harvest in September and October. But we'll think of something cool to do next month, and we will be in touch. Hope everybody stays healthy and safe out there. Take care. Thank you.